is that the directors of different versions will make choices not only about how the characters are going to act and about things like costuming and setting and so forth, but also what's going to be kept in the text. The Branagh version, which has every word of the play, as I said, lasts 4.5 hours. The other versions are half that length or less than half that length. So obviously something has to have been cut. Lines have to have been cut. Whole speeches have to have been cut. In some cases, whole scenes have to be cut or drastically abbreviated. So that, notice, we're seeing really a different Hamlet in each case. Branagh sets Hamlet in the 19th century, in what appears to be Scandinavia or something like Scandinavia, which of course is where the play is actually set. But when you look at it, it really looks more like Russia, 19th century Russia. But there are parts of Russia that are very similar to parts of Scandinavia, so not to make too fine a point of that. And people are dressed up in 19th century costumes. In Laurence Olivier's version, they're dressed up in Renaissance outfits, that would have been contemporary with Shakespeare and his audience. Zeffirelli has his actors dressed up in medieval outfits, even with guys with, armor and, medieval knights. Why? Because the play, while it was written and produced in the early 17th century, it was based on a story which goes back hundreds of years into the Middle Ages. And there actually was a story, by the way, that developed in Northern Europe about a person called Amleth, and which eventually spread, and Shakespeare apparently picked up some version of that story along the way. And of course, he greatly expanded it and turned the story, which is a pretty simple story in its earlier versions, into something incredibly complex. So, going back to what I said earlier, in our last class, that originality does not always consist in coming up with something that nobody has thought of before. Originality often consists of taking something that somebody has done before, but doing something way beyond what others have done with it. Every film version or stage version of Hamlet or any other play that you see is going to be an interpretation of the play, first of all on the part of the director, and then of course the director working with the other creative people, the costume designers, the set designers, if there's music, the musicians, the cinematographer, who's obviously critical in all of this, and of course the actors. But notice it will be the director or the director working with a team of creative people who will have a vision of what this play is about. And I want you to be thinking, what would you do with a particular character, relationship, scene, and so forth? How would you handle it? What decisions would you be making about costuming? If you're going to have Hamlet done in modern dress, why? What's the point of doing Hamlet in modern dress? Rather than, say, 16th, 17th century dress. Is I'm going to ask you to consider at least one version of Hamlet as an interpretation of the play, and then to offer your own ideas on how you would produce the play or some aspect of it. Now, obviously, you're not going to have time to talk about the entire play. But what you can do is you can focus on a particular scene. But notice, scenes don't exist in isolation, do they? How Hamlet behaves in the scene with Ophelia, where she has been put up to trying to test him. It's a trick by her father and the king, who are hiding behind a tapestry. And she's walking along, Hamlet comes up, and the interaction between the two of them is very interesting. Now, how that is portrayed is going to depend on how the director and the actors see that relationship. Okay, we're going to talk about that scene in detail a little bit later on. And we can take other scenes as well. What about the scene with his mother Gertrude? He's furious with her. In some versions of Hamlet, like in the Olivier version of Hamlet, he's up on top of her and he's just shaking her and so forth. And, you know, talk about Freudian. You know, I mean, it's bordering on the psychosexual. So that's a kind of interpretation that Olivier brings to the production of Hamlet. That's how he sees Hamlet. That's how he sees the relationship between Hamlet and his mother. And that's what makes sense out of how he has that particular scene presented. Also in the Olivier version, there's a point at which in Act 1, in which we're in a great hall. Here the king and queen and the counselors and the people of the court and so forth. And Hamlet is sitting over in a corner, dressed, of course, in his dark clothes because he's in mourning for his father, and who has fairly recently died. And his mother, of course, has remarried almost immediately. And the person whom she has married is Hamlet's father's brother. In other words, she's married her brother-in-law. And in those times, technically to marry your in-law was called incest. And that's what all the talk about incest is in the play. I mean, it's not incest the way you and I usually use the term in our time. We're talking now about hundreds of years ago, where it was against the rules of the Christian churches to marry your in-law even after the death of the person's spouse. And if you did so, you were accused of being guilty of incest. Okay, so anyway, Gertrude at one point comes down and she kisses Hamlet. Well, no big deal. I mean, after all, a mother kissing her son. Well, it's not quite that. As a matter of fact, I had one student a couple of years ago who had rented that version of Hamlet, and she was watching it with her mother. And she said, I was really, really embarrassed, not by the scene so much as my mother actually saw that scene too. And while she's sitting there with me, and that was really embarrassing. Well, because the way in which Gertrude comes over and starts kissing Hamlet, I mean, it looks like two lovers. Well, again, this is Olivier's, I mean, this is not, by the way, totally gross or you know, enacted for very long. It's just a couple of seconds. But nevertheless, it's enough to kind of make you sit up in your chair for a second. And then you look at other versions and you see, how do they handle exactly the same scene?